Hi, it's Dr. Shona Halson here, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the Physical Performance Show on the 24th of October, where we'll be talking all things recovery in the 3-hour live stream event. So we're going to cover essentially 4 modules around recovery. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of recovery. We're going to talk about periodization and adaptation. We're going to bust some recovery myths, and of course we're going to cover the best recovery strategy we have, which is sleep. So I'm going to go through a range of different things, talking about how we can help you pick your best recovery strategy, but also talk about some of the different aspects where there might not be a whole lot of science, to really help you look at how you can use recovery to really enhance your performance.
Hi, it's Adharanand Finn here, author of Running with the Kenyans, The Way of the Runner, and The Rise of the Ultra Runners. Also podcaster and many other journalists and other things. And you're listening to the Physical... I blew it. I'm not good at this. What is the Physical Performance Show?
That's the voice of this week's featured guest, acclaimed author of Running with the Kenyans, The Way of the Runner, and The Rise of the Ultra Runners, Adharanand Finn.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by our upcoming live stream event, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance, with prior featured expert of the show, none other than world-acclaimed Associate Professor Shona Halson. We're just weeks away from this exciting live stream learning opportunity. Be sure to secure your spot for the live stream today. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. Of course, we do this across a range of different episodes, expert editions, featured performers, coaches' corners, and interest editions. And as per the top of the show, you are in for a real treat on this episode 237 with Adharanand Finn. And during this conversation, we explore Adharanand's most recent publication, The Rise of the Ultra Runners, A Journey to the Edge of Human Endurance. It's a must-read book to add to your sports library. I finished the book myself ahead of recording with Adharanand, and it's a deep dive into the world of ultra running with all its quirks, unique experiences, and characters. And during today's conversation, you'll glean from Adharanand's journey as he entered the world of ultra running in the attempt to accrue points for the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc prized ultra trail running event. You'll hear Adharanand touch on the history of ultra trail running with the historical strange pursuit of pedestrianism, issue some very practical key learnings around how to descend or run downhill on trails, the importance of hydration and nutrition and fueling ultra running pursuits. And you'll hear Adharanand reference some stories from the rise of the ultra runners, including the foray of East Africans attempting the rigors of the ultra trail running world. By way of bio, Running with the Kenyans, released in 2012, was the Sunday Times Sports Book of the Year. It was also shortlisted for the William Hill Sports Book Award. The topic of this conversation, The Rise of the Ultra Runners, released in 2019, was also shortlisted for the William Hills Sports Book Award. In addition to authoring books, Adharanand is an avid runner himself, a very handy runner with numerous sub-3-hour marathons to his name. Adharanand is a well-respected journalist for The Guardian and also writing regularly for the Financial Times, the Daily Telegraph, Runner's World, Men's Health, and many others. Here is my conversation with acclaimed author and avid runner, Adharanand Finn, on all things the rise of the ultra runners. Adharanand Finn, acclaimed author, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I've been looking forward to this for some time. I just finished The Rise of the Ultra Runners today, this week, and it's a fantastic read. But more than that, there's of course other books in your authorship, Running with the Kenyans 2012, The Way of the Runner 2014. And if you are a runner, more than likely you've either read one of these books or come across your titles. So it's a real thrill, Aaron, to focus today on your most recent publication, but to also glean some of your learnings from the journey that you underwent.
Where are we gonna start?
More than just your authoring of these great books, you've been a lifelong runner. So take us through the chronology of your running years, with the latest evolution obviously being, we can add the label ultra runner now to your running bio.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways it's probably, I don't know about what it's like in other parts of the world, but in the UK, I meet a lot of people who've got a similar trajectory to me, in that I was quite a serious runner at school. I ran for the county. I was county champion cross country. I ran national championships. I took it pretty seriously. I was like training 4 or 5 times a week as a teenager, enjoying it, races most weekends. And kind of in my mind, I guess, I thought I was going to end up in the Olympics and that kind of stuff. But then I got to like 18, 19, went to university, other interests, the kind of discipline you need to get serious at that point, I didn't quite have it. And I guess I also wasn't really, in all honesty, it was good enough. I wasn't winning nationals, I was running nationals, but I was coming, top 20 rather than top 5 or something. So I guess deep down I knew I had to try other stuff. And then it kind of all fell away. And that kind of middle bit of my life, from about 20 to about 35, I still ran. I still used to run a couple of times a week just for my own pleasure. But I didn't really do much. I ran barely any races. And then I was about 35. You just suddenly think, oh man, I think I'd been down to watch the London Marathon because I was living in London at the time. Part of me was like, God, what am I doing? I should be out there. I should be doing that. I was very inspired. And, with my background as a runner, I just suddenly felt like I should get back into running. So I was also, by that point, I was a journalist. So I ended up writing race reports for Runner's World magazine. That was my kind of way in. I felt like I had 3 small children, so I had to kind of justify training in some way. So by turning it into a kind of job, so I was running these races as race reports, I could justify to myself and to my wife that I can't run these races without training for them, right? So gradually it built like that. And I ended up taking it the whole hog, both professionally in terms of my journalism and also in terms of my running, and going to live in Kenya in Iten. And that was a big leap for me. Up until that point, I was still pretty much running 2 or 3 times a week, not taking it that seriously. Then you turn up in Iten, in the Rift Valley, and suddenly you're in the center of the running world, and you're running every day. And everything changes. And then ever since then, I came back, and then also I'd written this book that then became this. It was a bestseller, really. I mean, I don't know what the official definition of a bestseller is, but it sold very well, and people liked it. And suddenly I was being asked to go to races, to write more, to run more, and it just grew. And so I ended up running about 6 or 7 marathons. I think at that point, I kind of just had this basic goal of sub 3 hours, which I kept hearing was a decent time. So I did that a couple of times. I went to Japan. That was partly the publishers were like, Running with the Kenyans has done so well, we need something else. And to me, the culture, and the running culture in particular in Japan, was so fascinating. It was so different to Kenya. It was all these relay races and these corporate teams, and it just felt like, let's go for something completely different. So again, but in both cases, I kind of turned it into an adventure. I took my whole family with me. We lived there for 6 months. I got as embedded as I could with the running culture. My family lived in a local house. And so the story is as much about my running and the running scene as about their experience and our whole. So when I write about Kenya and when I write about Japan, I'm not claiming to be the world's eminent expert. I haven't done academic studies. I've just told my story of what I discovered when I went there. And so again, I kind of did that in my third book, but instead of going to a geographical location, I went into this kind of subculture within running, which was ultra running, which actually weirdly had never really appealed to me. I was hearing more and more about it, but I guess for my days as a 1,500 meter runner, it just seemed like another world of backpacks and poles and food. I mean, to me, that wasn't running. That was like something else. You look at the speeds they're running. Even the guys winning the races are running 10-minute mile pace, which to me is like jogging. So I'm like, this is not serious running. This is just something else. I'm not interested. And then I kind of got into it slightly by accident. I got commissioned to run one and write about a travel piece on a race called the Amman Desert Marathon. And it totally broke me. I thought I was just going to cruise through it. And actually, I was doing quite well up to about day 4. I think I was in the top 20, clearly way overestimating my abilities or underestimating the challenge of a long race like that. And I completely got destroyed. I did manage to finish, but I mean, on the last 2 days, I was nearly last both days. And there were people in that race there was a woman in her 60s who was blind and had someone leading her, and she was beating me on the last few days. So I'd kind of really been hit. And I swore, what's interesting, and I'm sure almost everyone who's run an ultramarathon has done this. You finish your first ultramarathon, you say, never again. Do not let me go near an ultramarathon ever again. That was horrible. I hated it. But then it starts to play on your mind, the kind of intensity of the experience. I think at the time it feels like an experience you don't really want to have. But then afterwards, it's really clear in your mind, this experience of being that close, I don't know, to the limits of what you're capable of. And it's not quite the same, because you can kind of get a tiny taste of that even in a 5K or even in a mile. Everything's burning, but it's like 30 seconds or 20 seconds near the end. But this goes on for days. And so it starts playing on your mind starts getting involved. There's all sorts of different, because it's just so much more intense in an ultramarathon, I think. And so that kind of played on my mind. I thought, right, let's see what this is all about. And also I was interested why other people were doing it, because I did it because I was asked to do it. And I got because I was writing about it for the Financial Times, I got invited along, so I didn't have to pay, but it was an expensive race. It cost like thousands of pounds of dollars to enter the race. And so people are investing a lot in this just to kind of torture themselves. There must be more to it. And so there we go. I ended up ultra running, and I ended up pretty much enjoying it. Not every race, but and maybe enjoying it is not the right word, but I definitely became an ultra runner through it. And I actually, weirdly, I haven't run one since, but I'm planning my own, because there's no races at the moment. I'm planning my own 35 miles, so about 50 something K run tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
So I'm excited about that. I'm like, this is going to be, it's my first taste of going back into that experience of just losing yourself in, it's this one long trail which I've never run. I've run sections of it, and it's just going to be me and my legs and my food and nature and the intensity of all that. And so I'm excited.
You said you didn't enjoy, and you chronicle the races that you can, or the events that you compete in and complete in order to qualify for the big grand daddy of them all, the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, through the rise of the ultra runners, the book. And perhaps rather than enjoy in those experiences, Adharanand, you endured them. And I did laugh to myself when, in introducing this Odyssey, you mentioned your prior held beliefs, and I resonated with those. I too, coming from a road / triathlon background, used to think that, well, look, the ultra running is for people that can't run fast enough, so they just run, to the extremes until they can't run anymore. But boy, oh boy, is that shallow thinking.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, I like, you'd see someone walking up a hill and you go, oh, I mean, what are they doing? And so the first few times I would struggle to walk up the hills. I'd feel this is wrong. I've got to keep running. But, but then, 20, 30 miles into the run, I'm sat down, I'm crying. and these people go whizzing past me, like looking as fresh as they did at the beginning. And I realized, yeah, you've got to manage yourself. And even the great runners like Kylian Jornet and those guys, or Kylian Jornet, as he should be pronounced, they're walking here and there. But what's incredible is like, so there's one guy, for example, Damien Hall, who's a British ultra runner. And we have, well, not so much now, he's got faster, but when he first began ultra running, we had similar times over 10K, half marathon. And so he was like my inspiration. But we ended up running races where he was finishing 20 hours ahead of me. I mean, he'd been home, showered, eaten, gone to work the next day, come home, played with his kids, taking his kids swimming, come back, and I was still in the race. And so that difference, it just made you realize that there's a lot more to this ultra running than just your running ability. And that was a big challenge to me, because it's still ultra running. And I kind of, it took me a long time to realize it's a lot of it is about your mental state. It's about how organized you can be, your emotional state. So yeah, it's tougher than it looks if you're a runner running, half marathons at a good pace and you look at their pace. It's not as simple as that. Things don't extrapolate neatly.
It mirrors with, I've had one taste of an ultra, if you'd call it that, a 50-kilometre race in Australia, and I got to the marathon looking to the 42K mark, feeling pretty good, and then it just exploded, and I sat on the stairs just for probably half an hour and just was angry with myself for even taking part. This was in the lead up to the New York Marathon in 2015. And I vowed to never do one again. I still haven't, but there is, after reading this, I have felt some slight tug or pull towards signing up again. But Adharanand, you mentioned if you go to the crazy places, this was what one of the competitors you met at, I think it was in the Oman Desert Ultra Marathon, said to you, if you go to the crazy places, you meet the crazy people. And you certainly met some characters in your journey in qualifying for the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc.
Yeah, there was a point where everyone I met seemed to have this crazy backstory. I'd kind of meet ultra runners and I start asking them, why did you get into ultra running? And it was just, drug addiction. It was like, the funniest one was Camille Herron, who's one of the best female ultra runners around. And I met her just after she won the Comrades Marathon. And I go over to her and I say, hi, I'm writing a book about ultra running. I'd love to talk to you. And she just looked at me like with this crazy look in her eyes and said, you've got to talk to me. I've got a crazy story. I was like, whoa, okay. I was like, what is it? She's like, my whole family were made, when I was 16, my whole family were made homeless by a tornado. I'm like, yeah, right, that figures. Yeah, it's like everyone's like got this story. And in the end, it turned out that there were people who had a fairly uneventful upbringing in ultra running. I did find a few, but there definitely is this sense of you kind of work through stuff out on the trail. And also you've got to go to some quite dark places and be able to handle it. And I don't feel like I've had a particularly traumatic life. And there were points where I was thinking, I just don't need this. I haven't got any issues to work through. I can just stop. I'm fine with my life. I don't need to prove anything. And I felt like it was a disadvantage almost not to have these demons, which you could really drag out of those moments and go, no, I've got to show you I can do it. Or no, I've got to prove myself. Or, and so I can see why it can be an advantage. But then at the same time, it's not necessary. There are like Killian for one, and I'm sure I could think of at least one other example.
What about
someone who's not
Tom Evans? Tom
Evans, fairly normal,
well adjusted.
Well, not necessarily normal, but fairly untraumatic. Like he's quite interesting because he's basically he went from home to boarding school to the military back to living with his parents. I think so. I've met him a few times. Very nice guy, but he said he's never actually paid a bill, or he's never had to live in the real world. He's basically been in this institution his whole life. So but yeah, he doesn't have any trauma. He doesn't seem that crazy when you meet him as well. He seems quite normal. So, but all these ultra runners that I met were kind of crazy in a nice way. They kind of found away from their demons through the running. So people like, I met this woman, Katra Corbett, who had been arrested as a drug dealer. She was a crazy goth, and she was lovely. She was totally, and she through the running, she had found kind of peace with herself. And I think that's what it's about. So they might have these crazy backstories, but they're not necessarily in a crazy state when you meet them. And I think the running, that's what's attracted to them them to it in the first place. I guess there's quite a lot of people with quite obsessive personalities who that apply that to something perhaps less constructive in their earlier part of their life. Now they're applying it to running, and by its very nature, it's an extreme thing to do. An obsessive personality is going to do well at something as extreme as ultra running. So it kind of makes sense.
And Adharanand, you mentioned that, these unique characters that you beautifully capture their stories throughout the book. But then you also post the question in your search for understanding this subculture, or as you call it, this wide and broad church, which is ultra running. You post the question that perhaps it's also an avenue for people, perhaps like yourself, who need some suffering in your life that, because we're so comfortable. You found that as well, correct, out in your exploration, meeting these people, the Germans in the Amman Desert as an example.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I think, and in some ways that ties into why ultra running is becoming more popular. I think as more and more people lead comfortable lives where, maybe even as far back, not as recently as like the 1970s, still a lot of people were living quite tough lives. I mean, obviously some people still are, but particularly in the West, more and more people are leading comfortable lives, and they're kind of feeling a little bit sedated. And I talked earlier about the intensity of the feeling of ultra running. And somehow that, although it wasn't necessarily nice, it was suffering, it was difficult, the intensity is quite life-affirming, if you like. It kind of reminds you that you're a physical being on a planet, and that, especially when you're out there at night, and you look up and you see space, and you're on the side of a mountain, and it's very kind of visceral and kind of the essence of what it's like to be on this planet and be an animal and be human, rather than this kind of cozy, modern life of where every comfort is, the temperatures are just right, the air conditioning is right, even the car, you don't even need a handbrake anymore. It's just a button, remote controls. It's kind of the opposite of modern life. It's like an antidote. And I think, and not necessarily we need that in our lives, but part of us, we are still, I mean, sometimes we don't like to think about it, but we are still animals underneath, and we have these kind of animalistic needs. And I think being out in the wild, being tested, being exhausted, but having to fight, having to move on, having to challenge yourself is something that we appreciate afterwards, and reminds us of who we really are. And I think that's a big appeal to ultra running for sure. And it's quite interesting actually, because I had this project to bring some Kenyans into ultra running. And it was quite interesting. It was kind of a failed project, but I did manage to get one Kenyan guy who'd run a 2:07 marathon, I think. So he was pretty nifty. I got him to run this ultra run, and he was winning the race quite comfortably, and he hurt his toe, and so he dropped out. And I was just like, this is not. I was like, no, ultra running, things hurt. This is what happens. The toe is going to hurt. That's not a problem. That's a very minor problem. You keep going. He's like, no, my toe hurts. I can't run with a sore toe. I'm like, you can. And like, there were other guys coming into the tent because it was a lap. It was 5 laps of 10 miles. It was 50 miles. So he was on lap 3, and some people were just finishing lap 2, and they had, the blood, they like knees cut, they like blisters, and they were just laughing and bandaging it all up and heading out for more, because that's what they were getting exactly what they'd signed up for. Whereas I felt it was interesting afterwards. I really tried to work out why he dropped out so easily, and it's only an example of one, and it could just be in his personality or whatever. But part of me was thinking, he doesn't. He's come from a tough upbringing. He's led that hard life we were talking about in Kenya. He doesn't really need this suffering. He's like, my toe's hurting. I can see this is going to get worse. We've got 20 miles to go. I don't need to suffer here. I'm done. And also, as I think there was more to it than that, but it was quite interesting because there aren't many like Africans, like East Africans ultra running, and there's a whole lot of other reasons for that beyond this. But it is interesting that I think a big appeal of ultra running is that, I mean, Zach Miller in the US calls it the pain cave, and lots of the ultra runners describe it as the pain cave, and they say they relish the pain cave. That's what they want. They want to get to that place where they're suffering. Jim Walmsley says the same. He says, take me to that dark place, set me up next to someone else, and I'll run harder than them. Whereas the Kenyans like to run in this state that people often describe as effortless, right? This kind of state where they're just in flow, where everything's moving smoothly, everything's working. They're not looking for the suffering. The minute the suffering hits, it's like, well, we can handle this for a short while, but it's not what we're here for. And I think with some of the ultra runners, it was just a very different attitude. So it's definitely part of the appeal for as Westerners, but it could be, why it's not so popular in some parts of the world. Perhaps this is just me theorizing all over the place here, and I realize these are elements of a bigger picture. Let's say.
Yeah, there's so many factors, but I think you've really hit on something that's substantive, and as you cite in the book, and you just touched on, there's other factors for the East Africans. One being it's a commercial consideration for these East African athletes. They see their bodies as assets, and they know they've got X amount of matches to burn. And I did smile to myself when you're outlining that the pitch is that you're going to run double or triple the distance, and you're going to get paid half. Yeah. But if you can see the bigger picture, you might be the first poster man or woman for East Africans taking in part in ultra running.
Yeah, it did make me laugh because I think in distance running, particularly on the roads, from a 10K to a half marathon, you get paid more. In marathons, obviously, the prize money is bigger. They don't really think of it if they went downwards. Obviously 100-meter runners can still get well paid. Not like they're getting paid at distance. But they didn't go that far. But then the idea that you would then do an ultra marathon and the prize would, there is very little money in ultra running. That is starting to change slowly, which will be interesting. If anyone, whether it's me or someone else, can start to get some of the East Africans involved, will be interesting, because there are now a few races offering money, but it's still a pittance compared to road running. And so it's just, it just doesn't make sense to them to make that huge effort. They're doing it. Sometimes it sounds a bit mercenary. They're doing it for the money, but they're coming from a place where they need that money, and they use it not just to transform their own lives, but the lives of their communities and their families and what have you. So it's a big investment for them, and you could see, he was thinking, well, I don't want to, I don't want myself out for the rest of the year here. I could do it, get back, get another race. This is, although it's not a big injury now, if I run another 20 miles on it, maybe it will be. So I could see that. But like you say, I had this, the Kenyan guy, and I could see it in the ultra running world. People were getting excited. There's 2:07 guy. In fact, we kind of worked out he was probably the fastest marathon runner ever to run a trail ultra in anywhere in the world. There's been some 2:07 guys run Comrades Marathon, which is the ultra in South Africa. But on the trails, I don't think anyone that fast has ever done a trail. So there was a lot of excitement around it. And, if he'd won, which he clearly could have done, it would have been, within the ultra running world, would have been quite big news. But the ultra running world doesn't really stretch to a 10 in Kenya. And so, it didn't mean anything to him. To him, it was some small race in some field in some woods in going on a cold, wet day. And he didn't need that. And there was no prize money in that particular race. So he was running to basically qualify for another race. And yeah, it just wasn't a happening thing. But but he wasn't relishing the thought of suffering either. That's the other side of it. Which was
fascinating. Watch this space. I say one of the things I found so interesting is you chronicle the history of prior incarnations of ultra running, if you like. And this, I hadn't even come across the term pedestrianism. Can you share a little bit about this history? Because I think many people from the modern running world would be, even as a lifelong runner, quite ignorant to some of this fascinating history.
Yeah, I was really amazed when I unearthed it all, actually. And of course, I only really touch on it, but there are whole books on it. Yeah, in it really peaked around 1870, 1871, but in around that period in time, although it had been going on, the first fell race in the UK is dated the year 1086, so almost 1,000 years ago. There have been examples of kind of wagers where often wealthy men, either they wager one against the other, they could run 1,000 miles around this field, how long it would take them, or they'd get their staff to run and they would bet on their staff. But it really took off in the late mid-19th century, and the events at that point, the biggest events were these 6-day races. And so you would run often indoors in some venues. So Madison Square Garden in New York used to hold these, New York City, and there was a place in London that was holding them, and they were called the world title. And the prize money was huge. I mean, I worked it out in today's money. I don't have the figure to hand, but it was like hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money to win these races. And they were pretty much the biggest sporting events going. I mean, when you think about it, most of the modern sports we know hadn't even been invented at that point. Cycling didn't really exist yet. Motor racing, there weren't that many other sports around. But they really grabbed the public attention for a while, and they became huge events with daily news reports on the front pages of the national newspapers. And they were quite dramatic, and they became these kind of social events where people would turn up to be seen at the trackside. There was betting, there was like drinking, there was socializing. Yeah, and these guys became big stars, and it all kind of petered out with the invention of soccer and cycle racing. Kind of the same thing. They did 6-day races, but it was more dramatic because everyone was falling off and crashing. And it was a bit quicker, and so it kind of petered out a bit after that. But weirdly, some of those records that they set on the 6-day races in the 1870s, like a very tiny subculture of running carried on doing 24-hour races, 6-day races, 1,000-mile races. I mean, even today they're like a tiny part of ultra running, but they do exist. And some of those records lasted almost 100 years, pretty much till Yanis Kouros turned up and broke them all pretty much in like the 1970s and 80s. But yeah, they were doing some pretty decent times for 6-day races.
Just extraordinary. And thanks for unearthing that history, because as I was completely ignorant, and nice to know that at one point running was the center of the world's sporting focus.
It was kind of running, walking. It was, 6 days. You're not going to be going that fast, but it was called, I think it was Go As You Please. So, because they used to have walking races and you weren't allowed to run. But then in about that period in time, they decided, okay, if you want to run, you can run. You want to walk. And there was one guy he was a real crowd pleaser, and he'd play his trumpet while he'd run backwards and stuff. He became a real celebrity.
If that could be made sexy and entertaining, then there's no doubt that there's a big future for ultra running going forwards. And Adharanand, you mention many races, all the events that you take. You describe them really well in terms of your own participation in them, but and there's many of them on your way to accumulating points for the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc. Two that really jumped out to me were your experience with the Comrades Marathon and your experience with running around in circles for 24 hours. The latter had me laughing a few times. Maybe let's start with that. Yeah. Your 24-hour 400-meter track attempt. I think it was called the Self-Transcendence 24-hour race.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that weirdly I'd been to about a year before I'd even started the ultra running, I'd written an article about that race for the Guardian newspaper, and I'd just been to watch it, and it really fascinated me. These people went through this incredible experience on this tiny little stage. Really, I mean, in terms of running for 24 hours, just to be running around a 24-hour track. And I remember saying to one guy, I said, did you achieve self-transcendence? And he was like, I can't really answer that question. You know the answer, you've just got to do it. And I was like, oh man. And just this idea that just like without going anywhere, without going to the mountains or the desert, that you could have that same experience on a track in London was fascinating to me. And so I did it. And I mean, I did it in the middle of 2 other ultra runs, which was probably not wise, but I just felt like I had to do it. I had a couple of weeks before, I'd done a 135-mile run, and a couple of weeks after, I was doing a 100-mile in the mountains. And I was still, at this point, I hadn't done anything that far, so this was quite an intense period of time. So I kind of probably came into it not super well prepared, but at the same time, it was fascinating because I gradually broke down, as I did in most of my races, but much more dramatically in this one, to the point where I just couldn't carry on. And in some ways, the biggest challenge with that race is that because it's a time and not a distance, you can kind of stop. You can sit down, and it's like the race is still progressing. So like in the other races, if you're going to run 100 miles, if you stop, you're not going anywhere. So you've got to get up and keep moving. And there's this thing about relentless forward progression. Even if you're walking, whatever, just keep moving forward and you'll get there. But in this race, I started realizing, I can sit down. I can sit down 10 minutes. Oh, I can sit down 15 minutes. I can sit down 20 minutes. The race is still going. And they do have a rule. Like obviously you're trying to run as far as you can. That's the goal. So if you sit down the whole way, you're kind of defeating the object. And also if you sit down for more than 4 hours without crossing the finish line, they consider you out of the race. But that's quite a lot of time to do one lap. So the temptation is pretty strong. And as the more I got exhausted, the more tired I became, the more I was sitting down, and the more pitiful you start feeling, the more hopeless. And it's just this spiral of mental degeneration. And to the point where, well, you know, as you read it, I'm lying down in the back of the car. I've pretty much given up, even though I think I'll tick off a few more laps here and there just to get to the finish. And then I have this complete transformation. And the last 3 hours, I'm running pretty well. And the last 15 minutes, I'm like I'm doing a 5K pretty much flat out, which was so strange. And it just showed me that my body wasn't as broken as I thought it was, because there's no way I could have done that if I was in the state I thought I was in. And so I realized, that's when I really realized just the power of the mind in these events, and how that mind is kind of like an overprotective parent. I think I describe it. It just wants you to sit down and look after yourself and protect yourself. It doesn't care about the race. It's not worried. It just wants you to be okay. And you've got to have a way of overriding that and saying, no. I need to finish this race. I want to get out there. And that sounds simple, but in the heat of the moment, all your ideas, I mean, to the point where sometimes I was like, yeah, I'm writing a book about this. I've got to finish. And I was like, who cares about a stupid book? You know, nothing matters anymore. Just sitting down, giving up. That's all I want to do. And so you've really got to have, you really got to be strong mentally and have a really good reason why you're there. And particularly the races where, like that one, where I wasn't trying to get the points for the UTMB. So the UTMB, the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, which was my big goal, you had to complete certain races to get there. And so in those races, I kind of had a really strong why. I had a real strong reason to finish, because otherwise my whole plan was ruined. But in the track race, I could have just stopped. No one else, my kids didn't really care. My wife was, she was there, she was trying to help me, but it wasn't like a make or break thing that I finished this race. It was just me and the race, and did I want to finish it? Did I need to finish it? And that is just such a weird space to be in, where if you're not clear about that, it's so easy to stop. But of course, afterwards you regret it, and then you want to go back and do it again. And I think a lot of people go back to ultras. The dropout rate is huge, and a lot of races you meet people who come back because they dropped out the first time, and now here they've got their why, because they don't want to fail again. And you quite often hear, everyone came out, supported me the first time, I let them all down, I can't do that again. But the first time you don't have that, because it's just the first time. So yeah, I learned a lot on that race about what I was capable of, and also what I was capable of, how my mind was capable of controlling me and telling me to slow down and convincing me. I was convinced I couldn't carry on. I was convinced my feet were too sore. I was convinced, I can't remember what else, but I just had these, like my wife said at one point, what would Killian do? I'm like, what would Killian do? That's irrelevant. I'm not I don't have that body. I am broken. And it's actually, there was a really nice guy came over to me, and he said, are you injured? And I was like, well, I'm not injured. No, I had to admit that, I felt very painful. It wasn't an injury. It was just pain. He said, it would be a shame to give up now, just when it's getting interesting. And in some ways, I think I come back to that. That's, in some ways, that sums up the appeal of ultra. You get to that point where you want to stop, where you want to give up, where you're hating it, where it's horrible, but you've got to stick it out, because you have to get to the finish. In some ways, the finish can be an anticlimax. It's when you get to that point to see what's on the other side. So you come to this wall, and when you get through that wall, and that's what that guy said about self-transcendence. You can't really explain. I mean, I do my best in the book, but it's what's on the other side of that wall. And that doesn't always happen at the finish. Sometimes by the time you get to the finish, you're actually enjoying it so much. I had this a couple of times, and in the track race particularly, I didn't want to finish. I was like, I'm like in my zone now. Don't stop. And having been like desperate to drop out, I was now suddenly like, oh no, I've only got 3 more minutes. I got to keep running. This is so good. It's aptly named Self-Transcendence, because you really do transcend yourself. Not just in that race, but in ultra running, I think.
I did like the advice from one of the competitors that said you need to be, like you touched on, you need to be strong in your conviction to keep going. If your head is right, you can do it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You've got to, and that's what I realized. You've got to. Someone said you've got to have your trainers, you've got to have your bag, you've got to have your food, and you've got to have your why. And it sounds silly, but there's going to come a crisis point. Unless, I did about 10 ultras. I had one ultra where I never had this crisis, where I was just fine the whole way. And I think perhaps the more experienced you get, the more better you get at pacing yourself. Maybe that doesn't happen so much. But I think, and I was a little bit worried when I wrote this book that maybe it was just me having these crises. Maybe this wasn't going to resonate with other ultra runners at all. They're going to go, what are you talking about? Well, we just run and have fun the whole way. But it's been amazing. Every ultra who's read that has said, oh yeah, it's exactly what I go through. And even the top guys, the guys who are winning, they get to that point as well. The only thing is they have to push through quicker and harder, and they can't sit down, they just slow down. But sometimes they do. There can be some dramatic burn up at the front of ultra runs where guys are like flying along, and the next thing they've got a 10-mile lead, and you think, oh, it's 10 miles clear. Think of it in a marathon, maybe that's the equivalent of half a mile lead, and then within no time at all, it's gone because they're just eaten up.
Which is why when you took part in the Comrades Marathon there in South Africa, Bruce Fordyce, 9 times winner legend, shared the advice with you: start slow and get slower. And I really enjoyed how you described the emotions at the end of that race, because I think anyone that's completed something arduous, even if it's not an ultra run, can resonate with the emotions at the finish line. They just get you. Yeah,
exactly. And I think there's something about that race of doing it with so many other people, because quite often in an ultra run you finish pretty much on your own or with a couple of other people, and there's a real rawness to the emotions, but to be going through that with so many other people is quite an amazing experience. And I mean, there's like 18,000 runners I think that day, and a lot of them, this will be the biggest thing they ever do, is that they're not even necessarily serious runners, a lot of them. But in South Africa, Comrades is something, if you do any kind of running at all, or you've got any kind of status as a kind of active person, you've got to run Comrades. Otherwise, you're just not really, you're just lazy or something. So many people in South Africa attempt it, and it's a real collective experience. And also with South Africa's history, that I started realizing, I hadn't kind of realized how much the race has kind of been through that very difficult history that South Africa has had. And it's kind of always been, not always, but since like the 70s, it's been this kind of symbol of unity where the kind of blacks and whites would run together, would compete together. And it was kind of ahead of its time, not within the context of obviously a very divided country. And so Bruce Fordyce, who you mentioned, he supported the black runners, and he said the first few times when he was still unknown, and he used to wear a black armband to support the black runners, he said people would throw tomatoes at him and things like that because they thought that he was, who's this college? He was a college kid. Who's this college kid think he is? But then when he became popular, when he became the star, because he won it nine years. I'm not sure if it was 9 years in a row. It might have been, but he won it 9 times. And then everyone loved him. And I think he helped, in a way, open the race out. And so there was one point where I was running and some guy, there'd been a little bit of conflict within the race where we were running. 2 guys had bumped into each other repeatedly, and they kind of started shouting at each other. It's kind of weird. And then this guy just said, no, we're all one nation. We're the rainbow. Come on, forget everything. Today we run together. Today. And it was just this kind of surge went, like this collective energy went through the group. And I'd only been in South Africa 2 days. I didn't really have any connection with South Africa. I didn't know that much about it, but suddenly I was feeling it, and I can imagine if you're from there and you've got all that history, the race really, it's called the Comrades Marathon. It's about bringing people together, and they really, it's a really collective experience, a kind of cathartic collective experience in South Africa. And so I kind of felt almost like I was gate crashing this really emotional family occasion for South Africans, but it was wonderful to be part of it. Yeah.
And I think you did a great job in piquing people's interest that may have considered the Comrades before in, hopefully post the COVID era, getting on that start line to experience that. It certainly did for me.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of people who maybe the trail seems a bit alien, but if you've done a road marathon, Comrades, okay, it is quite far still, but it seems maybe a bit more within your reach, and it feels like you can still get that ultra running experience, but without having to kind of hike up mountains and stuff.
You're listening to Adharanand Finn, acclaimed author of The Rise of the Ultra Runners, on this, an interest edition of the Physical Performance Show. Support for today's show comes from our upcoming live stream event to be held on the 24th of October 2020 with prior featured expert, Associate Professor Shona Halson. Dr. Halson has been touted as arguably the world's leading expert when it comes to athletic recovery. And we've secured Shona for a unique 3-hour live stream event designed to help you navigate the world of athletic recovery. Now, whether you are an athlete, beginner through to elite, sports and exercise practitioner or coach, there will be a bucket load of learnings to be had from the live stream. Tickets are available from just $49 by jumping over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream. A post-event recording will be available if you cannot make the 3 to 6 p.m. time slot. And the modules covered include fundamentals of recovery, recovery periodization and adaptation, sleep science, and recovery science mythbusters. When it comes to recovery, I think in terms of a Shona Halson quote from episode 190, and that is, the only training that we are benefiting from is the training that we are recovering from. Now, I know you spend many hours training. Find out how to optimize your recovery from a true world-leading expert. There's lots of opinions and misguided information that flies about, so we'll look forward to seeing you on the live stream, 24th of October. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, acclaimed author of The Rise of the Ultra Runners, Adharanand Finn.
I recall Adharanand, a local legend here on the Gold Coast, Australia, who had his ticket for Comrades. He came in to see me just before he left the country, and he had a stress reaction in his talus, which, as you'd be likely familiar with, is not an area you really want to have a bone stress injury. And he went over there in a boot, which was appropriate management. And my suggestion was, start with the boot on. If you have to walk until you're outed by being behind the car, then just go as far as you can. Somehow, and having read the book, I kind of understand the energy maybe that he drew on to complete that. He completed the event, and somehow he didn't end up fracturing his bone and needing a pin in it. But he managed to get through that event, staying in front of the SAG bus or the SAG vehicle at the end and completing it with a boot on. Just remarkable. Wow,
that is amazing. Yeah, because the cutoffs they're fairly generous, but you can't. It's not a race you can walk the whole way. You've got to be running. It's they have these cutoffs and they're very strict as well. That cutoff, if you don't make it there, you're out. So that's impressive. Yeah.
Perhaps he took the boot off and he told me that the version that he thought was more physio-friendly, that I did it with the boot on. But he struggled and he got there, Bob. Adharanand, let's distill some of your experiences into a few practical applications and learnings. What would you say would be your best piece of advice to the first-time ultra trail runner? You're responsible for it, Adharanand. You have turned a lot of runners into now potential and want-to-be ultra runners. Now you've got to coach them. What's your number one tip on how to prepare for an ultra running event?
I mean, it does depend on the event, but the thing that kind of really helped me the most was learning how to descend a trail, which is easier said than done, of course, and a lot of it is just practice. So you've got to get out on the trails. This is if you're doing a trail race, of course. If you're doing a road race, this is irrelevant. Because the first few times in the mountains, I was losing so much time. I was struggling down these hills, too careful, and people flying by me. Down the side of a mountain, they can take miles out of me without any effort as well. It's almost more effort to go slowly because you're trying to hold your body up. A lot of it is just practicing it, just getting familiar with it, and your brain. there's a saying in the Lake District in the UK here where they're brilliant at trail running, and they say brain off, brakes off. And you don't take that too literally at the beginning, but it's about trying not to think too hard. You just watch where you're going, and you don't watch exactly where your feet are going. You need to watch further ahead. You need to be watching 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead. And that's a difficult thing to do at first, but that's what you have to do. And your brain will then just fill in, and it will take the right path. If you're watching where your feet are, you're going to fall over because everything's coming at you too quick. So learn to descend the trail and practice it. I guess it again depends on the race. If you're running in the mountains, you've got to stop obsessing with mileage and times. So I'd go out like for a 2-hour run, and then 2-hour run, I expect to cover a certain amount of distance. But what I realized, I needed to start looking for elevation. I needed to start looking for the steepest run I could find. And don't worry about, walking. Walking is something, if you're going to do a long trail race of more than 50K, it depends who you are, and depends on the elevation. But most of those big ultra runs, you're going to end up walking at some point. So practice that. You don't have to run every step. A funny little tip I often have, which is not really a training tip, but is for the race itself. Often the races, particularly these days, you have to bring your own cup. And you get to the aid station, they have water or like Gatorade or some energy drink, and you fill up your cup. And a lot of these bags come with this little fold-up cup, which doesn't really hold that much water or liquid. And I realized I was getting dehydrated in my early races. So I got this massive cup. It's like a huge thing. Very light. It was very light plastic. I just strap it on the outside of my bag. And then you have a proper drink when you get the opportunity, and you really guzzle it down. Yeah, I remember in the mountains in Italy, stopping at a stream and filling that up. But while everyone else is fiddling around with these clever little contraptions, I was just scooping it up. It probably isn't the lightest thing, and it did bang around a bit, but for me, it was worth it. They kind of say ultra running is like an eating and drinking competition with some running thrown in. And you really do need to get your food on board. Yeah, and I found like eating is quite tricky, but you can take liquid stuff in. But the big cup for me was revelationary. Is that enough tips?
That's brilliant. Eating and drinking competition with some running thrown in the middle, and you do explore in the book really well this idea of the benefits versus the drawbacks of wearing watches and digital technology, GPS.
Yeah.
And I smiled when I read around that Zach Miller living halfway up the mountain there on Pikes Peak, wearing his $5 Casio watch. So, and you seem to pick up on that sentiment and say, I've got to be in the moment. I don't want to be distracted. And I believe you ditched the watch for the grand finale.
I did. It was, for quite a few of the runs in the end. It was a shame because I would have got some great, Strava files of like some really impressive routes, but I had to give up on those because what I was finding was that the watch would beep and it was just a reminder of how far you had to go the whole time. It's like a constant reminder on your wrist. And that's the last thing you want to be thinking about. The last thing you want to be thinking about is you just got to be in the race, because the thought of when you're that tired of 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles, 50 miles, 80 miles, depending on how tired you are and how far you've got to go. Anything over, 10K is not going to feel like, it's not a good feeling. And it kind of takes the wind out of your sails. And ultra runners often say, break it down, just get to the next aid station or get to the next, checkpoint. Of course you can do that, but if you've still got this reminder, you've still got, another 60 miles after that. For me, mentally, it was destroying me the whole way. And when I took that off and I just realized, okay, I just keep moving, keep running till I get to that checkpoint. I don't need to think about how far that is, how long it takes. When it comes, it comes. When I'm there, I'll enjoy it. It was liberating. It was really liberating. And a lot of ultra runners, Zach's brilliant. Zach actually used to, before he got his $5 Casio watch, he was going with the clock on the screen in the hut where he lived. So he'd go out running for whatever felt like about 4 hours, come back. If it was only 2 hours, check the watch. Oh, I've only been gone 2.5 hours. I'll go again. It's like that's how worried he was about the time. A lot of ultra runners will say to you, and stay in the moment. Just run the mile you're in, or on the track, run the lap you're on. But I just found that the easiest way to stay in that mental state, in that state where you're very present, and also it's more enjoyable that way because you're not constantly worrying and thinking and beating yourself up about how far you've got to go. You can look up and enjoy where you are and take it in and realize, I'm I'm out here, I don't care. Part of the kind of the privilege of being able to run an ultramarathon is to be able to disappear into nature for, 24, 35, 45 hours and not have to worry about what time of day it is, what week it is, who your boss is, what he's thinking. It's just you, nature, and then the watch. Take the watch off and it's easier, I found. That was my experience. And it's definitely, I know some people feel real all at sea if they do that, and that's fine. If that's how you are, then fair enough. You feel like, oh God, I'm just going to worry more about the time because I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on your personality. But I can't obsess about the numbers. I don't know. I used to do maths and I start adding this, adding that, and drive myself crazy trying to work out how long it's taking me to do the last mile, how long the next mile. The checkpoint is this far. I just take that off. It's like, sigh of relief. Okay, now I'm just running. Great.
And even like you mentioned, like it's potential anxiety around how much further you've got to go. But I even think on the road scene, on pacing, it feels like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because you've either gone out too hard or you've gone out too slow, and either way you don't feel great.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed, I do a podcast as well, and I interviewed Abdi Nagay, who trains with Eliud Kipchoge in Kenya. Yes. And I asked him, what was the best bit of advice Eliud Kipchoge ever gave you? And he said, well, he saw me looking at my watch. He said, why are you looking at your watch? He said, take it off. He said, okay. So he said he stopped looking at his watch, and now he runs in freedom. He said, because he'd be running, and they'd be running like on a long run, they'd be doing like 2:46 a kilometer, which is quite fast.
Wow.
And he panicked. He's like, oh my God, I can't keep this up. But he said, well, maybe I can. It's only because I look at the watch, I think I can't keep it up. Maybe I can. And he says it's interesting. This is the guy running the most incredible marathons, and he's telling people to take the watch off, despite the fact that, for his sponsor, he always wearing it, but I don't think he's looking at it.
It's quite an oxymoron, considering it was the numbers that really catalyzed him into the worldwide attention with a sub-2-hour marathon that was all meticulously laid out with pacing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess in the race maybe it's different, but in the training particularly, I think, because some days you're feeling better, some days you're not feeling good. It's all about effort, really. And I think, I think in the training, he definitely does his best to drop the watch, I think.
Adharanand, before we get your physical challenge for the week, I just got to ask you about, there's one page in the book that I think I'll remember more than any page, and I'm not going to give it all away, but it was a description of the Dutchman in one of the events that was running along, stopped in the middle of the track, defecated, wiped his bottom, and then carried on as if it was the most normal thing on the planet, and ran past you and didn't say anything. I was laughing at that point out aloud, and I even read that paragraph out to my wife.
Yeah, I often wonder whether, because I don't know who he was or what his name is. I mean, I knew he was Dutch, and I probably could look at the results because we finished quite close, but I haven't heard from him whether he's read it or not. Whether he even knows about it. But yeah, that was it. And in some ways, I talked about getting into that animalistic state. I mean, I like to think I've still got my wits about me enough to think, well, I could just go in the bush there, that's fine. But you do, there are famous examples in running where people just do that kind of thing. And yeah, you get to a point where you don't care. I mean, I was talking to a guy called Dan Lawson, who's just broken the record. It's slightly different, but it's a similar idea. He just broke the record from one end of Great Britain to the other. He ran, it's nearly 1,000 miles. And he said, and he ran along the main roads. And he said, some of these roads were so busy, and there'd be these busy junctions. And he said, you get so tired, you just run across without even. And he said, I was so tired, I was thinking, if I get hit by a car, well, at least I get to lie down for a bit. And I think you get to that point where just the thought of even walking to the bushes, you weigh that up against the embarrassment, and maybe if you're Dutch, that's even less. And you think, well, I can't be bothered walking over there. I'm just so tired. I'm just going to go here and, to hell with everyone else.
You're listening to Adharanand Finn, acclaimed author and avid runner, on this, an interest edition of the Physical Performance Show. If you missed last week's episode featuring Commonwealth Games race walking 20 kilometre champion Jemima Montag, then here's a little snippet of Jemima's shared highs, lows and learnings.
How you fuel and how you recover combine with your training to then affect that overall performance. So my learnings and my ways forward after that disappointing disqualification only a few weeks after the Com Games gold was how important it is to work really closely with a sports dietitian. So I'm lucky to have Jess Rothwell, who was a race walker herself, so we really understand each other. She took a really great approach, which I'm studying a Bachelor of Science. And the way she explained relative energy deficiency to me was very much from a physiological point of view. And all of a sudden, I really felt empowered, understanding what was going on in my body and how my fueling and recovery and training could work together to elevate performance.
To enjoy the full episode 236, jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy the show from, and whilst there, peruse the archives dating right back to episode 1, featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, acclaimed author of The Rise of the Ultra Runners, Adharanand Finn.
What would be your single piece of advice to listeners of this show looking to perform at their physical best? I mean, you've explored the culture of Kenyan running, East Africa, the Japanese way of running through the way of the runner, and then now obviously exploring this church, as you call it, of wide and broad church of ultra running. So what would be your single piece of advice to help the listener of the show perform at their best across all these experiences and learnings that you've had?
So I'm only just thinking about this now, but probably the biggest lesson that that translates through all three books. For some people, it may not be a big deal at all, but for some people, it's like, well, I'd say do as much of your running as you can, and even if you're a road runner or a track runner, on trails. And I just think running on the trails is a kind of easier workout. It's a more all-round workout for your body. I mean, obviously, if you're a track runner or a road runner, you're going to have to do some hard stuff on the track and on the road, but particularly your easy stuff. Get out on the trails, move loose, be loose on the trails, and enjoy it. It takes you to more beautiful places. It's interesting, the Kenyans and the Ethiopians, they do almost all their training on the trails. And particularly in Ethiopia, the trails are quite, not all the runs, but a lot of the time they go up in these mountains where they're very uneven and they're jumping over rocks and they're zigzagging through the woods. And it adds interest to the running. It adds bounce to your cadence. I think trail running is really undervalued. And interestingly, in Japan, they're kind of terrified. The professional teams are terrified of running on the trails. And so they're just worried they might trip over and injure themselves. But actually, ironically, what happens through the repetitiveness of always running on the concrete, the injury rate was higher in Japan than anywhere else I went. Quite often, these professional teams in Japan, I've got maybe 12 Japanese runners and 1 or 2 Kenyans or Ethiopians. And it's really interesting because when they do their easy runs, they take the Kenyans to the park and the trail and they run around the trail, and the Japanese go off running around the streets. And I'd be like thinking, those guys running faster than you, maybe you should try and look at what they're doing and maybe take a leaf out of their book. I wasn't really there to give advice at that point. But to me, it seemed obvious. There's one of the key differences between the way they're training and the way you're training is they're always looking for the trails. And wherever they can find it. And I don't know if a Kenyan would necessarily tell you why. They would just say it feels better to run on a trail. I'm not sure they necessarily why. They have a scientific reason, but that's just. I remember in Iten, and I don't know what. Quite a few Kenyans, I'd say, if it's particularly been raining and the mud is quite hard to run on, I'd say, we go and run on the road, and they were like, only the Mazungu, they call the white people, they're the only people who run on the road here. We just wait for the trail to dry. We're in no rush. Yeah. So I guess, and a lot of people probably do that already. So a lot of people going, yeah, I do that. That's fine. But I know before I went to Kenya, I almost never ran on trails. And it's been transformative for my own running to get out all my easy runs. I mean, it's difficult here in England in the winter. It can be pretty muddy on the trails. So I'll run less in the winter, but in the summer, it's lovely. So it depends where you live and what you're up to. But that's my key. I think my key lesson
Wow, that's powerful across all really three experiences which you've written about, and I certainly observed that in my time in Ethiopia in February this year. I was struck by the fact that they'd in Mizan with Zane Robertson, they would go and just spend their running around a paddock that was lumpy or ducking, as you've seen, in and out of trees, and there was nothing manicured about their running environment. Nothing.
Yeah.
Not even the outside of the track where they do their intensity work. That's just dirt roads and bumps. So it was quite an eye opener. Every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So this is going to be interesting. Are you going to send people out to experience a 100-miler?
Well, no. I think the challenge would be to if they're going to do it, is to do a run without your watch. And I'd say if you really need your watch because you just you record everything on Strava and it just doesn't count if it's not on there, start it and put it in your pocket and don't look at it for the whole run and stop it at the end. Just go out and see how that feels. Does that feel different? You're not constantly aware of what pace you're going. So that would be my challenge. A nice, easy one, I think, really, compared to running an ultra marathon. Is that the kind of thing? Does that do the job?
I think that's brilliant. It's widely applicable. We're going to call it the Adharanand Finn Physical Challenge of the Week. I must ask.
You can still put it on Strava afterwards. You just don't look at it. Don't look at it during the run. That's the key thing.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. For those that want to follow along, where can you're up to a fair bit. You've got the Way of the Runner podcast, which we'll link up in the show notes, and I encourage people to check out. You also, and obviously COVID's probably thrown a little bit of a spanner in the works, but you do typically run some running camps at Adharanand.
Yeah, I have been running them in Etienne and in Chamonix in France, which is where the UTMB race starts and finishes, and then in the UK, in Dartmoor, near where I live, which is this wild area, national park. So yeah, they've all been cancelled this year, unfortunately, one by one. I kept some of them from March. I put off to October, and then October came around and we still couldn't do it. But hopefully there'll be a whole set of those back next year. Yeah, I have that. I have my podcast. So all of this you can find on my website, which is thewayoftherunner.com. So very simple. Yeah, I also have a Patreon page, which some people may be interested in, which is where you kind of support me, and it's almost like my subscription service. In return, you get like exclusive writing and kind of, we've got a book club where we meet up via Zoom and that kind of stuff. So that's my new venture. I even put up some fiction on there. So if you're intrigued to know what my fiction was, I actually just read it this morning, actually. I need to edit it a bit, but you can find it all via thewayoftherunner.com. There's links to everything in there. So
brilliant. And also your first name, Adharanand, on Instagram as well. And I must ask finally, you don't have to answer, of course. Any ideas of what's coming next from the pen of Adharanand Finn?
No, although I have some ideas, and there's a couple of pitches I'm putting together. But yeah, I don't want to say because it might not happen, and so there's nothing concrete yet. So, but yeah, hopefully some interesting stuff coming. Definitely not just sitting on my doing nothing.
It was a cheeky question, and I appreciate the answer.
Yeah.
Adharanand Finn, thank you for your contribution to the greater space of running and endurance pursuits, and also for your contribution to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to chat, Brad.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed Adharanand's share-ins. If you did, then please jump over and let Adharanand know what it was that you enjoyed from his share-ins. You'll find Adharanand's social media channels over at the show notes at pogophysio.com.au. Now, I suspect you have The Rise of the Ultra Runners on your to-read list. And if you don't, then please add it. It's a terrific read. I've ordered the back catalogue of Adharanand's work, including The Way of the Runner and Running with the Kenyans. They sit beside my bed, and I'm looking forward to devouring them as well. And be sure to jump over and check out the great work of Adharanand at thewayoftherunner.com. A massive thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design, and Lily Burden assisting behind the scenes on all things social media. Massive thanks also for leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes for the show. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you have been enjoying the weekly highs, lows, and learnings of the show. If you're yet to register for the upcoming Dr. Shona Halson live stream, then do not miss your spot. It's a unique learning opportunity with one of the world's true leaders in the field of athletic recovery. Recovery essentials for optimal performance. Tickets are just $49 and are selling fast over at pogophysio.com.au/Shona Halson live stream. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump back with Associate Professor Shona Halson herself in anticipation and in advance for the upcoming live stream event for a 2020 review of the world of athletic recovery. And you'll hear from Associate Professor Halson around periodizing your recovery, learning when to include recovery and when not to. Shona also shares richly around the belief effect around recovery agents. It's an expert edition you are not going to want to miss. That's next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.